We've all been there, right? Lying awake, just replaying something awful, something stressful in our head.
Oh, definitely.
It's that exhausting mental loop, the if-only loop. If only I'd left 5 minutes earlier, if only I'd said no louder, maybe if only I'd just stayed home.
Hmm.
And this kind of compulsive rehashing, especially when it comes to really traumatic experiences, it can become totally paralyzing. Your mind just fixates on this past control it, and it
Yeah,
never actually had.
exactly. And when the brain gets stuck in that cycle, it's not really processing the facts of what happened. It's dwelling on this fantasy, really, of perfect control that was somehow lost.
Right.
So today we're doing a deep dive into a very specific critical blueprint for breaking that exact loop. It's session 4 of cognitive processing therapy, CPT.
Okay.
This is one of the most rigorously tested, structured trauma treatments out there. And this particular session, session 4, is titled Processing the Index Event.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. So our mission today is really to get beyond the clinical jargon, the technical terms, and give you, the listener, a real glimpse into the precise tools that can help transform someone. Help them move from feeling like a victim of trauma to becoming, well, their own cognitive therapist.
That's the goal. And this structured approach, it demands a pretty radical skill. Learning how to accurately label the sequence of things, the event itself, the thoughts you have about the event, and then the emotions that follow. And crucially, understanding how they all connect.
Seeing the links.
Seeing the links, precisely. And right at the absolute center of that connection are what the CPT manual calls stuck points. This is really the core concept for this whole session.
Friction points.
Yeah, and these aren't just, bad feelings. They are maladaptive, kind of self-defeating beliefs about the trauma that have become totally internalized. They keep people just rooted in misplaced shame
Yeah.
or crippling guilt, pervasive anger.
So it's like the story you tell yourself about what happened.
It's the internalized narrative. Exactly. The one that says, it's all my fault, or maybe I should have known better, so I kind of deserve this. The entire focus of CPT session 4 is clarifying these assimilated, internalized stuck points, and then challenging them.
Okay, so let's start with the actual blueprint then. When a therapist sits down with a client for this really pivotal session 4, what are they actually trying to achieve? And you mentioned it's structured differently. Why is that?
Right. The goals are very precise here. We're moving beyond just talking about the trauma, like in earlier sessions.
Yeah.
And we're starting to really analyze the trauma narrative itself.
Okay.
So the primary aims are kind of twofold. First, making absolutely sure the client can tell the difference between the actual event, the thoughts about the event, and the emotions that result from those thoughts.
Event, thought, emotion. Got it.
Exactly. And second, the client needs to be able to clearly see the causal relationship between those three things. How A leads to B leads to C.
That seems pretty fundamental. But why is the session unique in how it approaches that?
It's because of the increased intensity of the cognitive challenge. This session, session 4, it's designed to use far more Socratic dialogue compared to the others.
More questioning.
Much more question. So instead of the therapist just, presenting information about trauma theory, the therapist spends most of the time asking these really targeted, clarifying questions. They're designed specifically to help the client examine the logical validity of their own assumptions.
Ah, so it's less teaching, more guiding the client to figure it out themselves.
Exactly. The client has to do the heavy cognitive lifting. They have to arrive at a different conclusion through their own reasoning, prompted by these questions.
So it's not a lecture, it's more like an investigation of your own internal story. Okay, so what does the minute-by-minute flow look like for this pretty intensive session?
Yeah, it flows very deliberately. It's structured to really maximize the time spent challenging those stuck points. So it usually starts with about 5 minutes of administrative stuff and assessment. That includes giving or collecting the PCL-5 form, the PTSD checklist.
Okay, the PCL-5. For anyone maybe not familiar with that acronym, what's its purpose right at the start of this session?
The PCL-5 is, well, it's crucial. It measures the severity of the client's current PTSD symptoms. It looks across 20 different criteria.
20.
Wow. So collecting it right at the start lets the therapist quickly gauge progress from the previous week, and importantly, it helps guide the conversation by highlighting which symptom clusters are still most active. Things like hypervigilance or those negative thoughts and beliefs we're talking about.
So it's like a quick snapshot of where the distress is highest right now.
Exactly. It provides a kind of roadmap for the current level of distress.
Helps focus the session.
That makes sense. Focus is the target.
And
Okay, what happens right after that assessment piece?
then the bulk of the early part of the session, maybe about 10 minutes, is spent reviewing the ABC worksheets. These were assigned homework from the previous session, session 3.
Right, ABC. A is the activating event,
Correct. B is the belief or the thought about the event.
and C is the consequence, usually the emotion or the resulting behavior.
Got it.
And when the therapist reviews these, they prioritize the assimilated thoughts in that B column.
Assimilated. Okay. And assimilated means the thoughts the client has basically totally swallowed whole, internalized as absolute fact, right? The ones that are most woven into how they see themselves.
That's exactly it. Assimilation means the belief has just been absorbed without any challenge. It often shows up as statements like, I am worthless because this happened to me.
Wow.
Yeah. If they had managed to accommodate the event, which is the healthier outcome, they would have processed it logically, adjusted their worldview slightly to fit the new information. But often, the first coping strategy is just to absorb the guilt, the shame assimilated.
I see. And that leads right into the main event of the session then?
Precisely. So after reviewing those ABCs, the therapist spends a really concentrated 15 minutes, sometimes more, dedicated exclusively to addressing those stuck points they just identified, using that intensive Socratic dialogue we mentioned.
15 minutes of focused questioning.
Yeah, it's the core cognitive work. Then there's a 10-minute segment where they introduce a really critical conceptual tool. It involves explaining the differences between something being unforeseeable versus being responsible for it, versus being truly at fault or to blame. This helps clients stop using that word fault so inappropriately.
Okay, that sounds crucial. Unforeseeable, responsible, blame.
Mm-hmm. And the session usually wraps up by introducing the sort of ultimate self-therapy tool, the Exploring Questions worksheet.
Yeah.
That takes about the final 10 minutes.
Okay, I want to circle back for a second to the review of those ABC worksheets. The source material mentions that reviewing them often helps identify new stuck points, ones that might actually emerge during the session itself. That suggests just talking about it can still generate these distorted narratives.
Oh, it absolutely can. The mind is constantly, trying to make sense of what feels like nonsense, trying to impose order on chaos.
Right.
And when you look closely at column B, the beliefs column on those worksheets, really predictable themes start to emerge. Themes that solidify into those deep stuck points we need to challenge.
Like what sort of themes?
Well, the most common one is immediate, pervasive self-blame. Sometimes it's phrased in a really deceptive way, like, if the trauma happened in childhood, the stuck point might be, I was only a child, so I should have known better.
Wow, that's a tragic kind of cognitive twist, isn't it? Taking the responsibility an adult might have and putting it onto a helpless child.
It really is. Another major pattern we see, another common stuck point, comes from a failed accommodation. This is where the client holds on to beliefs rooted in what's called just world thinking.
The idea that the world is fundamentally fair.
Exactly. The belief that bad things only happen to bad people. So if something terrible happened to them and they believe they're a good person,
Then they must somehow be at fault. Otherwise, the world doesn't make sense. It's just chaos.
that's spot on. It's like the denial is a desperate attempt to hold on to that myth of a just world. It maintains this underlying feeling of unfairness, injustice, or this misplaced desire for control. If I figure out what I did wrong, I can prevent it next time.
Which fuels anxiety.
Hugely. And what's equally complex and often a really difficult stuck point for the therapist to navigate is something called erroneous other blame.
Erroneous other blame. What's that?
This is where the client blames people who were nearby, people in their proximity, but who are not the ones who intended the harm. Instead of blaming the actual perpetrator or maybe just random circumstances,
So blaming people who didn't actually cause it. Like, who?
it could be non-offending parents, in the case of childhood abuse, or maybe a commanding officer in a military context, rather than the enemy combatant.
Yeah.
People who are also potentially victims of the situation themselves.
Why? Why would the mind do that? Why shift the blame from the person who actually caused the harm to someone nearby?
Well, often it's simply a safer target. Blaming the perpetrator directly or confronting the sheer randomness and unfairness of life can feel just too overwhelming, too frightening.
Ah, okay.
The non-offending parent or the commander, they might feel more accessible somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe the client feels safer expressing anger towards them than towards the actual source of the violence or trauma.
So, like the veteran example you mentioned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A military veteran might focus all their anger on the unit commander for choosing, say, a faulty patrol route, rather than confronting the terrifying fact that the enemy intentionally targeted them. The focus gets really severely distorted.
Wow.
And the therapist's job then is to zero in on that distortion using those clarifying Socratic questions. Gently guide them back to the facts of who intended what.
Okay, so let's really dive into the practical side of this. The Socratic dialogue. You've mentioned its purpose is super pragmatic, helping the client figure out if their thought statements are actually factually correct or if they're just a heavily guarded stuck point. It sounds less like a friendly chat and more like a gentle but pretty relentless investigation.
That's a really good way to put it. It is a therapeutic investigation,
Mm.
and the therapist has to maintain a high degree of neutrality throughout. They're generally operating on a rough 80-20 rule.
80-20.
Yeah, about 80% of their talking should be asking clarifying questions, and only about 20% exploring alternative thoughts or interpretations. The therapist isn't there to give them the answer.
Right.
They're there to help the client find the answer within their own mind
Yeah,
by challenging the facts they're holding on to as absolute certainties.
makes sense.
And, we have a really powerful case study in the source material for this session. It involves a rape survivor who is struggling massively with this intense, consuming self-blame.
Okay, yeah, let's walk through that specific dialogue. I think it could really illustrate the kind of precision needed to get underneath the shame and uncover the actual facts.
Definitely. So the client's stuck point was just absolute, written plain as day on her ABC worksheet. It is all my fault.
Just flat out, it's all my fault.
So the therapist, knowing they can't just argue with the feeling of guilt, immediately targets the core assumption behind it, the assumption about consent and intention. The therapist asks a very simple foundational question. Did you want this to happen?
Which the answer has to be no, right? But I imagine the belief system, that stuck point, fights that admission tooth and nail.
It does, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the client confirms, no, I did not want this. And then she starts recounting some of the details, saying she clearly said no, maybe 4 or 5 times, and that she actively tried to push the assailants off her.
So she did resist.
Yes. And the therapist then stops her from minimizing that resistance. They start to challenge the fault assumption directly, kind of invoking the law of accountability. They ask something like, okay, given those circumstances, based on the actions you did take the refusal, the struggle, at what point do you think it stops being your fault and becomes legally and factually their fault?
Whoa,
Yeah.
that's an extremely powerful question. It forces a shift, doesn't it, from this purely emotional assessment, which just defaults to guilt, towards a factual accountability, which has to point to the perpetrator.
It's designed to be a jarring moment.
Yeah.
Designed to break that guilt loop. Now, the client, still wrestling with that deeply internalized belief of fault, might initially suggest things like, well, maybe I should have fought harder, or I should have run away earlier, or maybe I could have found a weapon.
The if onlys again.
Exactly. But the therapist then carefully points out the facts that the client herself provided, facts she might have been minimizing or ignoring in her own narrative. Well, the therapist confirms the facts. There were 2 assailants. The client had her legs pinned down. She literally couldn't move them. And she was hit in the face when she resisted.
So the therapist is essentially acting like the client's own defense attorney here, presenting the clear facts of her resistance back to her as undeniable evidence against the fault claim.
That's a great analogy, yes. The therapist repeats these facts back, confirming, so you were actively resisting under extreme physical duress against a numeric disadvantage. Is that an accurate summary of the facts? And this kind of reframing, it allows the client to really see the evidence of her active opposition, which is the direct counter-evidence to the stuck point that it was all my fault.
So what's the cognitive shift that happens after that factual reframing? What's the result?
Well, in this case study, the client eventually acknowledges, okay, it wasn't my fault. I did what I could do in that moment. That right there, that's the key cognitive insight. It is. Because before that Socratic challenge, the client was just consumed by overwhelming guilt and shame. But after the facts are laid out and accepted, the emotions get relabeled by the client herself as sadness and also appropriate anger directed at the perpetrators.
That is a massive shift. Because guilt is so corrosive, right? It's like a self-inflicted wound based on believing you're at fault. But sadness and anger, those are natural, non-shaming responses to an unwanted, violent act committed against you.
It's exactly the difference between self-condemnation and realistic grief or appropriate anger. This shift allows the client to finally process the emotions that would naturally occur during a non-consensual violent act, rather than getting stuck maintaining that debilitating, inaccurate assumption of fault.
Okay.
And the therapist might then transition by asking something like, okay, if it wasn't your fault, what do you regret about the situation?
Shifting from fault to regret.
Yes. And this often brings out the true regret. Things like maybe regret that she didn't see it coming, or regret that she couldn't scream louder. And regret, unlike that crushing weight of guilt, is actually manageable. It's something you can process and learn from rather than being defined by it.
That's a beautiful transition, actually, from fault to regret. And it leads us perfectly into the next major conceptual step in session 4, doesn't it? You mentioned this idea that traumatic events are often, by their very nature, characterized by being unforeseeable and unpreventable.
Mm.
Yet, clients so often fall prey to what you called hindsight bias, believing they should have known or should have done something differently.
Yes, exactly. Hindsight bias is this powerful cognitive illusion. It's the feeling that because you know the outcome now, you somehow should have possessed the magical foresight to predict and prevent it then. It's an inherent trap our brains fall into.
Right. It sets an impossible standard.
Completely impossible. And this is precisely why Handout 9.1, titled Levels of Responsibility, is so essential at this stage. It provides 3 really distinct logical categories that help the client move past, using that single blanket term fault, which they often use inappropriately to describe basically anything bad that happened near them or to them.
Okay, let's really delineate those 3 levels with precision, because it seems like understanding the correct associated emotion for each level is just as important as the definition itself.
Absolutely. The emotion piece is key.
Yeah.
So the first level is unforeseeable.
Unforeseeable.
This means fundamentally there was just no way a reasonable person could have predicted this specific event would happen. It came out of the blue,
Yeah.
defied logic or any reasonable expectation.
Okay. And the emotion.
The appropriate associated emotion here is grief or sadness. You grieve the loss, the negative outcome, not your supposed failure to prevent something that was truly unpredictable.
Okay, so things like a random natural disaster or maybe an unexpected medical diagnosis or even getting laid off due to huge economic shifts way outside your control, those would fall under unforeseeable.
Precisely. Those are good examples.
Right.
Now, the second level is responsible. This is a really critical distinction.
Responsible, okay.
Here, the person did play some role in the event unfolding.
Yeah.
They took an action or maybe failed to take an action. And this is the crucial part, they did not intend the resulting catastrophic outcome.
Intent is key.
Intent is the differentiator. So maybe they were negligent, maybe they made a mistake in judgment, but the harmful consequences were not deliberately sought after.
Okay, so using your example earlier, if I was running late for work and decided to speed, and then I caused a minor fender bender, I am responsible for the accident because I chose to speed, but I didn't intend to get in an accident or hurt anyone.
Exactly. You made a choice, speeding that increased risk, and it led to a negative consequence. You are responsible for that choice and its outcome.
And the emotion for responsible?
The appropriate emotion for this level is regret. You can regret your choices, your actions, or your inactions without having to accept malice or some intent to cause harm. Regret acknowledges your role without assigning yourself as evil or bad.
Okay, that makes sense. Regret, not guilt. And finally, the third level, which is fault blame. This must be where the intention comes in.
Exactly. Fault, blame, or you could say culpability. This level involves intended harm or intended negative outcome.
Okay.
This means the person acted with malice, perhaps, or with such a blatant and severe disregard for obvious, predictable consequences that it resulted in harm.
And the emotion here is guilt.
Yes. The associated emotion here is appropriately guilt. Guilt is intrinsically linked to having committed a wrongful act, either intentionally or perhaps through a gross, major failure to act responsibly when the negative outcome was reasonably foreseeable and preventable by you.
The legal context analogy you mentioned the source uses, that seems like it really helps solidify why survivors get these terms so mixed up.
It does, because the legal system hinges so much on intent. So think about a driver. If a driver is obeying all traffic laws, driving the speed limit, paying attention, and suddenly a deer jumps out into the road, causing a wreck that's generally unforeseeable, the driver might feel grief or sadness about the deer or the car damage, but not guilt.
Right.
Now, if that same driver is texting while driving a negligent action, clearly increases risk, but they probably don't intend to crash and they hit a telephone pole.
Yeah.
They're responsible for the crash due to their negligence. The appropriate feeling is regret.
Okay.
But If that driver intentionally turns the steering wheel, aiming the car at a specific person or object with the desire to cause harm or damage, that is fault blame. That warrants guilt.
And what we often see in trauma survivors, especially victims, is that they incorrectly adopt the language of fault for situations where the actual facts, once you uncover them with Socratic dialogue, really only support unforeseeable or at the very most responsible.
That's precisely the issue. They internalize this thought. It is my fault. When the much more accurate factual statement would be something like, I blame myself for something I did not intend to do, or maybe I blame myself for failing to prevent something when it was actually impossible for me to prevent.
So a core part of the therapy is helping them replace that emotionally loaded language of fault with the more objective, factual language of responsibility or unforeseeability.
Exactly. It's about aligning the language with the reality of the situation, specifically regarding intent and reasonable predictability.
Okay, so once the client has that framework, unforeseeable, responsible, fault blame, the therapy can then move to directly challenge the specific cognitive errors, the faulty thinking patterns that are propping up those stuck points. We touched on two really crucial biases earlier that keep the shame and guilt going. The first was that hindsight bias.
Right. We talked about it generally, but let's look at its specific role here in maintaining stuck points. Hindsight bias basically ensures that the client genuinely believes they should have had knowledge of a future outcome, knowledge that was simply unavailable to them back when the event was unfolding.
Right, the crystal ball effect.
Exactly. It's the ultimate form of self-criticism, isn't it? Retroactively judging your past actions, using the perfect 2020 knowledge you only gained after the devastating outcome occurred.
It's like rewatching a horror movie and yelling at the character on screen, "Don't go in the basement." You forget that they didn't know the killer was down there, even though we, the viewers, do.
That's a perfect analogy, and the source material gives a poignant example. A client who was traumatized as a young child assumes that their child self should have somehow possessed the foresight, the power, the understanding that the adult perpetrator had, the psychological impossibility.
They're judging their 6-year-old self using the knowledge and standards of their 40-year-old self.
Precisely. It's completely unfair and illogical, but it feels true because of the hindsight bias.
Okay. And the second major bias you mentioned was outcome-based reasoning.
Yes, outcome-based reasoning. This is the belief that because an event had a really bad negative outcome, the client must have done something fundamentally wrong to cause it.
Ah, linking bad outcome directly to personal error.
Exactly. And it stems directly from that just world myth we discussed. If the outcome is terrible, then the action that came before it must have been fundamentally flawed or wrong. Otherwise, the world doesn't make sense.
And they get stuck trying to find that supposed flaw.
Yes. They spend enormous mental energy trying to pinpoint exactly what they did wrong so they can guarantee a different, better outcome next time, which of course just fuels hypervigilance and anxiety about the future.
Okay, let's try and apply this to the second case study you mentioned from the sources, the one involving the combat veteran. This case seems to show really clearly how tangled up anger, guilt, and even core self-identity can become when these biases are running rampant.
Yeah, this veteran was struggling with two major but interconnected stuck points. The first one focused on his actions, or lack thereof, in the moment. If I had been able to cover my buddy, he wouldn't have been killed.
Which sounds like pure outcome-based reasoning, right?
Yeah.
Bad outcome, buddy killed, means my action or inaction must have been wrong.
Textbook example. And his second stuck point involved this intense anger, but it was directed at his unit commander, combined with intense self-blame. He blamed the commander and himself for deviating from their usual patrol protocol. They moved to the front of a house during contact when they usually covered the back.
Okay, so anger outwards and blame inwards, both tied to this deviation from routine.
Correct. Now, the therapist, recognizing that the anger towards the commander is emotionally charged, but potentially a distraction from the core guilt.
They don't get sidetracked by the anger.
Exactly. They don't engage in that distraction initially. They gently but firmly redirect the focus back to the first, more primary stuck point, the guilt about failing to cover his buddy. The Socratic questioning here is designed to introduce cognitive flexibility and, crucially, to destroy the certainty of his counterfactual belief.
The certainty that things would have been different.
Precisely.
So what does that actually sound like in the session? How do you challenge that deeply held belief, I could have saved him if only...
Well, the therapist challenges the certainty of that outcome. They might ask questions like, okay, what evidence do you actually have that if you had been in the front, where you believe you should have been, according to protocol, that you wouldn't have been shot also.
Ah, introducing doubt about his own survival in that alternate scenario.
Exactly. Or, what evidence do you have that your buddy wouldn't have been killed anyway, perhaps by the same explosion or gunfire that might have been waiting for you if you'd been in the front?
Okay, that really forces the client to confront the fact that his belief, if I'd done X, Y wouldn't have happened. It's just an assumption of almost godlike control over the situation, not a statement of fact based on physics or military reality.
Yes. He's forced to realize he's clinging to a fantasy that if he had just done this one thing differently, the outcome would definitely have been positive. He's assuming he had foresight that even the enemy probably didn't possess.
Which is hindsight bias in action again?
Right back to it.
Yeah.
But this particular case, it goes even deeper, because the client doesn't just feel guilt. He refers to himself intensely as a monster or a killer. He's struggling profoundly with the actions he took in combat where he did take enemy lives.
Wow. So this moves way beyond regret over potentially failing to protect someone into a full-blown core identity crisis. How on earth does the therapist even begin to address that kind of extreme self-labeling?
Well, the therapist has to establish context first. They need to explore the mission context. So they ask things like, okay, when you killed, what was your job? What was your mission at that moment?
And the client's response.
Client confirms. His job was protecting himself and protecting his platoon from an attacking Viet Cong unit. They were under fire.
So self-defense and defense of others.
Correct. Then the therapist might gently contrast this with a situation where killing is generally seen as acceptable, even good in society, like, say, a mother protecting her child from a violent attacker.
Okay.
The client can usually acknowledge the difference in intention and societal judgment between those scenarios, but he really struggles to apply that same non-judgmental logic to himself.
It sounds like the logical part of his brain can see the comparison, but the traumatized part, the part identifying as a monster, just refuses to accept the absolution.
That's often exactly the dynamic, which is why the therapist that introduces the cognitive science of survival. They explain what happens physiologically in extreme danger, how the body produces massive amounts of adrenaline and endorphins.
The fight-or-flight response?
Exactly, activating that innate fight-or-flight response. And they explain how the survival part of the brain, the amygdala, essentially takes over and can temporarily shut down or override the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain.
Ah, so the actions taken were driven more by a biological survival mechanism, perhaps, than by cold, premeditated, murderous intent?
Precisely. The client's brain wasn't calmly weighing options. It hadn't put on the brakes because it perceived a life-or-death situation. This helps shift the narrative. It moves from, I am a killer because I fundamentally am a killer or wanted to kill, towards something like, I am someone who is killed, yes, but in the specific context of war, for survival, likely due to biological necessity under extreme duress.
It separates the behavior, which occurred under intense pressure, from the client's entire complex self.
Exactly. It creates that crucial separation. And that separation leads directly into another powerful tool the therapist uses here, the slice of the pie analogy.
Slice of the pie. Okay, tell me about that.
This analogy is just crucial for helping someone integrate the trauma without letting it completely define who they are. The therapist urges the client to think about their entire identity as, say, a pie chart,
Okay.
and then to consider all the other slices that make up that pie, that make up who they are besides the trauma identity. Things like being a son, maybe a husband, a father, a worker, a friend, a neighbor, someone with hobbies, all these other roles and aspects of self.
Right.
The part of the pie labeled killer, if it even needs to exist with that label, after the discussion about context, it might only be one small slice, representing actions taken during a few specific traumatic moments in time. It is not the whole pie.
So the cognitive distortion the client was trapped in was basically assigning 100% of their identity pie to that one negative slice, ignoring everything else.
That's exactly the distortion. And by forcing the client, gently, to acknowledge the vast existence of all the other slices, all the positive roles they still fill, the relationships they still have, the skills they possess, the therapist helps move the focus. It shifts from defining oneself solely by the trauma towards integrating the traumatic event into a much more balanced, complex, and ultimately accurate view of their whole identity.
That sounds incredibly powerful.
It can be. And the source notes that by the end of this kind of discussion, this particular veteran reported feeling less despicable. He even started to consider the possibility, maybe for the first time, of feeling proud that he had successfully protected his men during that engagement. A huge shift.
That really is profound work. Okay, so now we arrive at the kind of ultimate tangible tool for helping the client sustain this kind of cognitive self-therapy outside the session. This is the Exploring Questions worksheet, which you said is often handout 9.2 or 9.3 in the CPT manual. This is what the client takes home to actively practice becoming their own therapist, right?
Absolutely. This worksheet is designed for rigorous self-examination. Its purpose is to challenge those identified stuck points systematically, really pushing beyond the raw feelings and digging into the objective facts or lack thereof.
Okay.
And the instructions are meticulous. The stuck point they choose to work on must be a clear belief statement. It can't be just a feeling like, I feel guilty. It also can't be a vague statement. It needs to be a declarative belief like, it was my fault, because you can only really challenge a specific assertion.
Right, you need something concrete to question. And the therapist arms the client with 7 specific guiding questions designed to dismantle that belief. Let's walk through these 7 questions in detail, because they really seem like the engine of change here.
They really are the mechanism.
Okay.
So question 1 asks, what is the evidence against this stuck point?
Against it, not for it.
Exactly. This is foundational cognitive therapy. The client must actively search for evidence, facts, experiences that do not support the negative belief. And the key rule here, which is really powerful, is that you only need one verifiable exception to prove that a belief is not an absolute fact.
Just one.
Just one. So if the stuck point is, I am completely useless, finding one single example of a useful action they took just this week, maybe helping a friend, completing a task at work that immediately disproves the completely part, the all or none assumption.
Wow. That's powerful. It removes the burden of having to prove the total opposite. You just need to prove the stuck point isn't 100% true, 100% of the time.
Hmm.
Okay, what's question 2?
Question 2 is, what information are you not including about your stuck point? This helps the client realize their belief might be unrealistic or incomplete because they're being too self-focused, only looking at their own role.
Broadening the perspective.
Exactly. Are they leaving out important external factors? Details about the situation itself. What about the actions or intentions of other people involved? For instance, if the stuck point is, I should have stopped him, are they conveniently forgetting to include the fact that the perpetrator was maybe physically much larger or armed or perhaps highly manipulative?
Right.
They get challenged to account for the role of all the actors and all the situational factors, not just their own perceived failure.
Okay. Question 3 tackles that cognitive trap of rigid, inflexible thinking. Does your stuck point include all or none terms?
Yes, these are those absolute words we mentioned. All, always, never, must, should, every time. These words are huge red flags for black and white thinking.
Because life is rarely black and white.
Almost never. So if the client believes I must always be perfectly prepared and then they fail just one time to be perfectly prepared, their belief system dictates they are a total failure. Yeah. So the therapist helps them identify these absolute words and then practice rephrasing the belief into more moderate, flexible, and realistic statements. Like changing, I must always be prepared, to something like, I generally prefer to be prepared and I do my best, but sometimes unexpected things happen.
Much more forgiving and realistic. Okay, question 4 uses that concept we just discussed. In what way is your stuck point over-focused on just one piece of the event?
This is the direct, practical application of that pie chart analogy we talked about with the veteran.
Right, assigning blame or cause.
Exactly. The stuck point often assigns like 100% of the blame slice or the cause slice of the pie to just one factor, usually themselves, while totally ignoring or discounting all the other contributing factors.
Like what other factors?
Oh, things like the weather conditions at the time, maybe institutional failings or lack of resources, the perpetrator's deliberate choices and actions, systemic issues, or even just plain bad luck or random chance. The worksheet prompts them to actually try and break down the cause into percentage slices. And often when they do that honestly, they realize their own contribution, if any, was actually a relatively small percentage of the whole picture.
That could be really eye-opening. Okay, question 5 digs into the reliability of where the stuck point even came from. How is the source of information for this stuck point questionable?
This is so crucial, particularly in cases involving long-term abuse or trauma that happened in early childhood. The client's original narrative, the source of their stuck point, might be based on information from a totally unreliable source.
Like who?
Well, maybe it came from their own interpretation as a traumatized young child who would naturally interpret events illogically or egocentrically. Or, very commonly, the stuck point might be based on statements made by the perpetrator themselves.
The abuser telling the victim it's their fault.
Exactly. A perpetrator often says things like, you deserve this, or you made me do this, or it's your fault I got angry. And the client needs help recognizing that this source of information is inherently unreliable, deeply biased, and certainly wasn't aiming for the truth. It was aiming for control or self-justification.
Got it. Question 6 deals with that tricky difference between something being highly possible versus absolutely certain. You mentioned this often fuels anxiety and hypervigilance. The question is, how is your stuck point confusing something that is possible with something that is definite?
Yes, this is a major area of cognitive distortion for trauma survivors.
Right.
They confuse probability, even high probability sometimes, with absolute certainty.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A common stuck point might be, if I trust other people, then I will definitely get hurt again.
Okay, that sounds absolute.
It is. The factual, more flexible counterstatement would be, if I choose to trust others, there is always a risk that I may get hurt. See the difference? Possible versus definite.
Yeah, huge difference in implication.
Huge. And the manual clarifies this beautifully. Living in the world always involves managing risk. We drive cars, even though we know a crash is statistically possible. We don't act as if a crash is a definite certainty every time we get behind the wheel. And we need to apply that same logical flexibility to social interactions and relationships, too. It's about managing risk, not demanding impossible certainty.
Okay. And finally, the last question, number 7, brings it right back to the root of the problem, separating subjective feelings from objective reality. In what ways is your stuck point based on feelings rather than facts?
This is the anchor, really. Feelings, especially intense ones like guilt or fear, are incredibly powerful, and they often translate directly into a belief that feels like it must be true simply because the feeling is so strong.
So the thought process is something like, I feel overwhelmingly guilty, therefore it absolutely must be my fault.
Exactly that. Or, I feel intensely afraid right now, therefore this situation must be incredibly dangerous. The therapist teaches the client that just because you feel unsafe, it doesn't automatically mean the environment is definitely objectively dangerous in this moment.
Right. Feelings aren't facts.
Feelings aren't facts. And more importantly, the intensity of a feeling does not validate the factual truth of the underlying belief that's driving it. The intensity is a consequence of the belief, not proof of the belief.
Okay, so the final assignment, the homework, is for the client to pick one of their main stuck points each day and diligently work through these 7 challenging questions, using the worksheet as their guide, to actively engage in this self-therapy process.
That's the practice. It's the consistent, repetitive effort of applying these questions that really builds new, more flexible, and fact-based neural pathways in the brain. It trains them to become their own cognitive therapist. Hashtag tag 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 outro.
Wow. This deep dive into just one session, session 4 of CPT, has really shown the profound power that comes from this kind of structured analysis, especially the ability to clearly distinguish between those 3 levels: unforeseeable, responsibility, and fault blame. It seems like it completely shifts the internal conversation, doesn't it? Moves it away from just a purely emotional, often self-condemning reaction towards a more logical, factual assessment of one's actual role or lack of role in the traumatic event.
And that shift is the integration we've been talking about all along.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate purpose, the goal of relentlessly challenging those stuck points is exactly that, putting the traumatic event into its proper, realistic context. It means systematically replacing those unrealistic, often almost omnipotent beliefs about the control you supposedly had, beliefs fueled by hindsight bias, and replacing them with a factual, balanced narrative. The event happened, yes, and while you may have played some role, maybe made a choice you regret, which falls under responsible, that role was almost certainly not intentional or based on some deliberate failure to prevent the unpreventable, which would be fault. Context is everything.
Which brings us, I think, to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over.
Yeah.
If the core problem in getting stuck after trauma is often asking that question, why? Why did this happen to me? Which is a question that often seems to be searching for past blame or certainty that just isn't there. Then maybe this whole process, this deep dive into challenging stuck points, teaches you to fundamentally shift that internal dialogue. The shift is away from the unchangeable past, away from the why me, and towards a question focused on future influence. Okay, now that this has happened, what knowledge can I take from it? What actions can I take going forward that might influence future events based on a balanced, factual understanding of my actual role and capabilities?
Yeah. It really moves the focus, doesn't it? Away from seeking certainty about the past, which is impossible, towards exploring possibility in the future, which is always available.